Welcome to Chess with Link. Today we're going to be talking about two openings which can dramatically improve your playstyle, especially if you're moving from the beginner to the intermediate range of chess play. We're talking the King's Indian attack and its relation, the King's Indian defense, both of which emphasize playing on the king's side of the board or drawing your opponents into conflicts at the middle of the board without putting your pieces directly in danger too early. Let's see how these two openings tend to develop, and then we'll look at two high-level chess games, and you'll be able to see how even advanced players sometimes use this opening to prepare themselves for a battle. The King's Indian attack begins with not moving out your king's pawn at the beginning of the game. Oh, sure, you could choose to do that and then transpose into the King's Indian attack, but at its core, the attack is about getting your kingside knight, your g-pawn, and your kingside bishop out and ready to fight. Now, it might look initially like your bishop is stuck behind your knight, but notice that the knight has two solid options of places to develop in the future, depending on how black moves their pawn or whether they bring out their knight or their bishop. And what about our king? Our king is now ready to castle after only 3 turns. And we are ready to continue developing either in our center or freeing up our queenside knight and bishop. It's a nice, quick, easy way to apply pressure to the center. Pressure which could possibly even give us an attack all the way across the board to our opponent's A8 rook if they are not cautious. By allowing our king to castle early and applying pressure to the center without standing in the center, we give ourselves many options for the future. The King's Indian defense often emerges after your opponent opens with a queen's pawn. Instead of opposing the queen's pawn directly, we can choose to bring our kingside knight out. Look familiar? When white continues, often by trying to consolidate power on the queen's side of the board, we can push our own pawn forward, just like we did when we were playing the attack. From here, our goal is to get our bishop to g7. Just like when we were playing white, our goal was to get our bishop to g2. And the benefits are pretty much the same. Now, if white has chosen to develop their queenside knight, we might not have as easy an attack towards the rook. But let's be honest, you're unlikely to be able to actually attack that rook. It's about the threat, it's about the pressure, more than the actual likelihood of capturing it. And now, black is all prepared to castle, and just like when we were playing white, we're ready to also begin applying more pawn pressure at the center, or freeing up our queenside pieces to play. I really enjoy playing these openings because they give me the opportunity to hold castling in reserve and use castling as maybe a waiting move or an opportunity to bring my rook into the fight about 6 to 10 turns into the game, after I've developed more of my central or queenside pieces. In our first example game, we're going to see a delayed King's Indian attack. We begin with a very standard opening. King's pawn moves out and is gently opposed with a bit of a French defense. We continue building out our pawn, and it is worth noting that when the queen's pawn comes up to d3, this is usually an indication that white is considering going for a King's Indian in the future. Not guaranteed, they're keeping their options open, but it's the most common continuation from this point. Now, as black continues along a fairly standard French line, opening up pressure onto the center and making the queen and bishop able to move in the future, if not immediately, white brings their queenside knight out. Again, this is about flexibility. This is about keeping pressure on the e4 pawn and making it less likely that black will go for any sneaky attacks over there on the light squares on the b side. Black responds by starting to develop their own possibility of castling and getting some pressure on our e4 pawn. And here, white actually steps into the first of the King's Indian attack moves. Now notice that black could attack our e4 pawn, but they're probably not going to. And remember that in high-level games, you're rarely going to see immediate captures. From here, black frees up their king for castling, not going for a King's Indian defense, because of course the bishop is not sitting in the fianchetto position. Speaking of which, white clears the path, preparing to bring the bishop up to g2. At this point, black is trying to pull white back over to queenside. Black is ready to castle, and also has some pretty decent pressure in the center. They've also played the French defense initially, and that often ends up with the bishop going over to b4, so we want to give that some support. White allows that to keep building. They don't want to be distracted. They know that if they can get their bishop to g2, they now have a very flexible continuation. From here, we can see the moves develop over the next few turns until both sides have castled and white has pushed up to e5, as well as making sure that they have the option of bringing out their c1 bishop once they get their knight out of the way. Now, at this point, engines give black a very mild advantage. See if you can think of why. Is it about the amount of pressure that black has at the center of the board? Is it about the positions of the pieces? Or that really strong pawn chain being built up? What about white's position? How is white going to turn this from a mild disadvantage and feeling a little underdeveloped? Because admittedly, white went two different directions with this opening and then did have to oppose black's pawn in the A file. So white's development does feel a little hampered here. But where will they continue? See if you can think of a good path, and then compare it. I'll link to my study in the description below, and in that study you will see that white manages to continue developing and then wins the game a good while down the line. Let's take a look now at how a high-level chess player uses the King's Indian defense both effectively and maybe a little bit more efficiently than white played that King's Indian attack. White begins with a queen's pawn opening, pretty solid path to follow, and black takes one of the two moves that are generally considered to be best against white pushing out the queen's pawn. Conveniently, bringing that knight to f6 also is a step towards the King's Indian defense. When white brings out their knight, still possibly heading in a couple of different directions here, black pushes their g-pawn, creating that pocket necessary for the fianchettoed bishop. And then bringing the bishop out. At this point, all black has remaining to do is castle, and they will have done a classic King's Indian defense. But where is this going to take black? Let's go ahead a few more moves and see what both sides might be thinking here. Hopefully you notice some similarities to the previous game in which white had developed their queen's pawn and their queenside knight, but now that knight is sitting in a slightly different location. How is that going to make a difference for white moving forward? And how will black handle this? Well, in this case, black makes a subtle move. They're trying to make sure that their bishop has room to get out, as well as making sure that either the E or C pawn can push forward in the future with support. There's a lot of ways that white could have continued from here, but they go for the more aggressive route, bringing that bishop out to put pressure on the knight. And from here, black makes a very classical response, trying to say, hey, back that bishop up out of my territory, which white does, technically pulling back onto their half of the board, but maintaining pressure on the f6 knight. From here, we're going to go ahead with that path that black was establishing by pulling their d6 pawn forward. And at this point, does this look familiar? Does this remind you at all of some of black's moves in the previous games? Because remember, one of those skills to try and build as you're practicing your chess is training your mind to recognize patterns that allow you to move from one set of moves which may be becoming uncomfortable and move into a different set of moves that you're more comfortable with. White goes ahead and gives a little bit more defense to their d-pawn, but black captures. And at this point, we can feel the tension starting to build up, especially in the d-file. Even though black didn't put any valuable pieces there, and even though white is currently occupying one of the central squares and threatening all of the central squares, note that an engine analysis actually gives a very slight edge to black here. That's one of the cores of hypermodern chess, to threaten the center without actually putting your pieces in danger. Black goes ahead to castle, and white brings their kingside bishop out. And this will hopefully give you a good opportunity to notice how that bishop going to e2 does help to protect the king some, and it does have options. But even though that bishop technically has a little bit more room to move than our g7 bishop, it doesn't really have terribly many more options. It's being smothered by its own pieces just as much as our bishop that's sitting there behind the knight. And that's one of the powers of playing a King's Indian attack or a King's Indian defense, or just generally fianchettoing your bishops. When you can get those bishops to b7, g7, b2, or g2, it gives you so many options. And if you can, of course, get your bishop out across the board, well, you can put so much pressure on your opponent's pieces and then start building up maybe a little bit of a more direct attack on the center. Now, at this point, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the analysis has shifted to a slight advantage for white. And black does manage to dig out of that problem and turn this game into a win. So what I would challenge you to do is take a look at both of these games and watch how, in the previous game, white uses a King's Indian attack and turns it into a victory, and in this game, black uses a King's Indian defense and turns it into a victory. And then there are 2 more games in the study that I link to down below. So, if you want to improve your chess game, step through those games. Take a look at how these powerful players moved. And do your best to try and understand why they made each of those moves and predict what they will do next. Thank you for joining me today, folks. And I hope that you try bringing some of the King's Indian attack or King's Indian defense into your chess game, whether you are able to follow the exact main line or whether you bring a little bit of the philosophy or style in and transpose into these attacks later on in your game. Have a wonderful week.